Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lindsay Knight, Chief Impact Officer at Blue Star Families. Thank you so much for joining us today. The Blue Star Families Applied Research Team explores the data and findings from our 2023 Military Family Lifestyle Survey. This work is always made stronger through our collaboration with the Daniello Institute for Veterans and Military Families at Syracuse University, and we are thrilled that our friends at IVMF are here to review the data with us as well. Before we go any further, I would like to thank those of you who attended our in-person, because guess what? It's no longer COVID, yay! But our in-person event, Recruit, Rethink, Retain, last week on Capitol Hill. I heard we had some incredible turnout from policymakers, from researchers, and from community organizations in attendance. As we get an in-depth look at the data today, I want to remind you that in order to help find solutions for these issues, we all need to do our part. On that note, I would love to share this great video our team put together, highlighting some of the issues that our military families are facing and the work that the annual Military Family Lifestyle Survey does to bring them to light.
It is a crisis that's been long in the making.
One of the top reasons people say they'll leave the military is because of spouse career challenges.
It was a question no one was asking at that time. How does unemployment affect the military spouse? It was a total new concept. And when we first launched the Military Family Lifestyle Survey in 2009 and fielded that question, what we learned changed everything.
On a fundamental level, it impacted my financial stability to the point that it dictated which neighborhood I could live in, which home loan I can qualify for, whether or not I have to really pinch pennies and try to cut corners and not send my child to that club that could help them establish new connections in our new community because we don't have the money right now. We are not sure when I'm going to get a job.
Since we launched Joining Forces more than 10 years ago, I met her and spouses like her everywhere I go.
From that moment forward, we collectively put the pieces together, painting a clearer picture of the impact military spouse employment has on the military family, on retention of the service member, and on recruitment for the next generation.
To see the way the notion gains steam across all channels, the White House, federal agencies, private sector support, and nonprofit partners, it just reinforces that this is an effort that will take all of us doing our part.
The way that inspires me is just the advocacy for the equity, that we add a level of awareness to where it's a force multiplier as we're bringing forth these issues.
Spouse employment isn't just the right thing to do. It's an essential part of our military's readiness.
So we need to work together to help military spouses get jobs, which means fewer families will go hungry, and it'll be easier to retain forces and recommend military careers.
And we're doing just that. Together, we're building up to the progress and solutions that all military spouses deserve. But we can never forget that it all starts with the one question and the trust in us from military families to make and inspire change from their answers.
It is now my honor to introduce a very special guest to you all let me start that over again. It's been a long week, everyone. It is now my honor to introduce a very special guest to you all. She will be joining us this afternoon to share a bit of her story. It's Mrs. Michelle Brito. Michelle is a seasoned military spouse, mom of an active duty captain, an Apache helicopter pilot, a financial specialist, and an all-around incredible human being. We are also fortunate to have Michelle serve as a Blue Star ambassador, and she will soon be one of the faces of our neighborhood, joining conversations with military families like many of you. Her husband is General Gary Brito, a commanding general of the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command. Michelle, first of all, thank you for your service to our families and for joining us today. Over to you.
Wow. Lindsay, thank you. You're incredibly kind. A whole lot of accolades there. But anyway, thanks. Thanks for having me. It is my honor to be here. Thank you.
Let's dig into a couple questions before we get into the weeds on the data deep dive. What resonated with you most after reviewing this year's findings?
I think what resonated with me most is and sadly, I'm not surprised, military spouse employment. It has been an issue for decades. I grew up in the military. My stepfather was Air Force, served 20 plus years, and my mother was a teacher, an elementary school teacher. And so I watched growing up as she would change, we would move from one state to another. And my mother always struggled to be able to go into her profession, getting new licenses with each different state, and also starting over again each time as far as retirement, pension, that type of stuff. So yeah, but I'm happy that nowadays there are so many people and so many agencies talking about military spouse employment and trying to make a difference.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that, by the way. And this builds a little bit on that personal narrative and experience. What did you find most concerning or troubling about some of the results from this year?
Concerning, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Maybe the housing costs. And that's a tough one. Inflation and all of those things. You mentioned my son is active duty, and he's stationed in Hawaii. Poor thing. But he gets a pretty good, at least in my opinion, gets a lot for BAH. Yet his rent still is hundreds of dollars more than the amount of BAH that he gets, and that's Hawaii. So, cost of living there is higher, but still it's difficult. And my son is a captain, like you said. So, he has it a little bit easier than some people, but it's concerning that, soldiers are still having to come out of pocket.
Yeah, and just the challenges with making ends meet. I was at Camp Pendleton yesterday, touring with some active duty and enlisted families, and Southern California, similar thing. Cost of living is just sky high.
Absolutely.
So as a segue to that, how do the findings mirror what you are seeing out there in the community as you visit Army installations?
Very much the same thing. Last year, I think throughout last year, I was going around and visiting different installations with my husband. And I always made a point of doing a roundtable discussion with spouses of all ranks, just to talk with them about any challenges they were dealing with, and just, what was on their minds. And so, of course, like we said, military spouse employment was one of the top issues. But another thing across the board last year was childcare, the ability to find it, afford it, and all of that. So I was a little surprised that it was not higher on the list. And maybe that is a reflection of the measures that DoD has been taking to try and help with that. So I don't know, but I think it's great that DoD is attempting to help with that, issue.
Yes, we wholeheartedly agree. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to know that the work that is being collectively done by the groups and folks who are attending today's webinar is being heard and leading to real conversation and real change for military families. We appreciate you being a great friend and advocate to Blue Star families as always. And for everyone who is attending the webinar today, I'd like to invite you all to join Michelle again on March 27th in our Blue Star neighborhood for a mingle and chat. It's a great opportunity to grab your favorite cup of coffee or tea, bring your wins and losses, and hang out with Michelle and some of your other neighbors. Please look to the chat for an RSVP link, and we hope to see you all there. It is now my distinct pleasure to welcome Monique Street, our JPMC Financial Deploy Fellow from the Blue Star Families Applied Research Team, to set the stage for the next hour. Thank you all again for joining us, and I look forward to diving into all of the data with you. Monique?
Thank you, Lindsay. The purpose of this deep dive is to provide a granular look at the survey data itself. In the next hour, we hope to accomplish 3 goals. 1, to share our findings from this year's survey with you all. 2, answer any questions about the data or the findings. And lastly, to inspire continued conversation on these topics and encourage you all to continue sharing your voices with us, because our 2024 survey launches next week. Because this is a live session, the research team will do our best to answer your questions, but some questions will require some more digging, and we may not be able to provide an immediate answer. If we cannot provide a response in the session, we are taking notes and may be able to respond in a follow-up email. I also want to note here that the research team might not be able to answer all questions as the data may not allow it. Often when we drill down to very specific groups, the sample sizes are too small to responsibly report. Your questions, however, can provide some direction for future survey iterations. Inevitably, answers to your research questions provoke more research questions, but an annual survey like ours allows us to continue that research conversation in subsequent years. On that note, I'm excited to announce that Blue Star Family's 2024 survey launches next week on March 27th. We hope that you will share it with us broadly so we can continue this work. Lastly, there are a few ground rules we'd like to cover for today's discussion. To ask a question, please type it in the chat. We have several team members who can respond to questions in chat or direct them to the attention of the facilitators. We will also be recording the questions and will send a follow-up email with the questions and responses. Please be respectful and considerate when framing your question, as we will remove vulgar, inappropriate, or inconsiderate participants. We know that these stats are not just data points, but do reflect real people's real lives. They can evoke stories and memories of personal experiences. We welcome your experiences, and if you would like to share your story, Blue Star Families would love to hear it. Please reach out to media@bluestarfam.org, and we'll drop that address in the chat as well. Finally, as you probably noticed from the Zoom pop-up, I'm providing another friendly reminder that we are recording this session. I would now like to welcome Dr. Jessica Strong to help us get a closer look at our survey findings for this year.
Wonderful. Thank you, Monique. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Michelle, for kicking us off. I am delighted to share our findings with you today. Showcasing the work that our team has done and sharing it with all of you is truly one of the highlights of my year. You all here today are why we do what we do year round. So I'm so excited to dig in. So let's, next slide, dig into the data. Or first slide, actually. This slide, that's the one. So let me start with giving you some background on the sample. Our survey was fielded between May and July of 2023. We had about 7,431 respondents, including active duty, National Guard, Reserve, and veteran family respondents. One other thing that I want to note this year is because the MFLS has been fielding since 2009, this year we reached over 100,000 cumulative responses over that period of time. So we've heard from that many participants over these years telling their story about military life. But back to this year in 2023, you'll see that the largest group of respondents are spouses of active duty, spouses of service members, followed by a sizable number of veteran respondents, then service members, and then spouses of veterans. It's really important to note that the survey sample is a convenient sample, meaning it's not weighted, it's not generalizable to the entire military family or veteran population. It does, however, amplify military and veteran family voices and provide some insights that can be further explored in other research and used to better understand military families' experiences. It's important to note that because it is a convenient sample and it's a family survey, it differs from the entire active duty population in several important ways. It's a family survey, so we tend to get spouses and people who are married. So respondents are usually married, they're older, they're often more senior ranking than the active duty population as a whole, which obviously has a very large junior enlisted population. In terms of rank, the largest group that we see is ranks at the 04 to 06 ranks. That's about 30% of our sample. We also have about 26% of our sample that represent the E5 to E7 ranks, and another 21% that represent the E7 and E9 ranks. So you'll see it's very, very focused on mid to senior enlisted and mid officer ranks. That's the largest proportion of our respondents. In terms of branch, most of the services were represented at rates within a few percentage points of the active duty force, with the exception of the Marine Corps, which was slightly undersampled. So if you're a Marine Corps family who is with us today, please join us for next year's survey, and everybody else can join us for next year's survey as well. That's next week. Next slide, please. Okay, these are the top issues for active duty family respondents. The majority of our findings are focused on active duty family respondents, although we do have findings on veteran transition, as well as a data sheet on National Guard and Reserve family respondents. But for active duty families, spouse employment remains the top concern, followed by time away from family. Military pay and BAH off-base housing issues follow these top two concerns, very similar to what we saw last year. This year, relocation and PCS issues has dropped off the top 5 and was replaced with dependent children's education. Those two sort of flip-flopped from last year to this year. One of the things that I think it's important to note as a comparison to last year is I think that we're starting to see these issues be a little bit less concentrated. So last year, it was very clear that financial struggles with military pay, BAH and housing, and relocation were top of mind for families, as the proportion of respondents who selected these concerns was 40%, 40%, and then 37%. This year, each of them have dropped slightly. So we're seeing sort of a spreading out of different issues rather than a concentration of issues around financial struggles. So let's get into the rest of the data. Next slide, please. Now that we have an overview of the sample and the top issues, let me move on to the findings themselves. The introduction sets out why we need to continue to understand these issues, focusing on how we can sustain a volunteer military with declining recruitment and declining interest in recruitment. Next slide. Military families and veteran families are critical influencers for young adults' decisions to join the military. Among new recruits, the most common sources of information about military service outside of a recruiter is from a friend or family member who served or is serving. Military families not only continue family traditions of military service, but they also reach people outside of the military bubble. 2/3 of active duty families are already sharing their experiences with civilians. More than 1/3 of active duty families had encouraged an acquaintance to enter military service. And of those, 1/3 actually, they did know that 1/3 actually did go on to enter military service. And of those who did, more than half weren't previously connected to the military. So military families can be support and augment, that's the word I was looking for, augment recruiting by sharing their stories, sharing their experiences. Military families can expose civilians who aren't otherwise affiliated to the military lifestyle and encourage new volunteers. Next slide. And this becomes increasingly important as we see a declining trend for families recommending military service. Blue Star Families has been tracking this issue for a while, looking at families' likelihood to recommend military service to young family members. We know that many people joining the military today are part of a family tradition of military service. So we saw in 2016, over half, 55% of our active duty family respondents would recommend military service to a young person. But in 2023, this drops to just 32%. Furthermore, on the other end of the spectrum, we see those who are unlikely to recommend has doubled from 15% to 31% from 2016 to 2023. So it's important to address these things. And that's what we're doing with this report, is looking at the impact of many of these quality of life concerns on likelihood to recommend military service. Next slide, please. We obviously want to help reverse this trend. So we look at things like housing, spouse employment, healthcare access, and veteran transition. One of the positive findings this year is that families who feel like they belong to their communities also have the greatest well-being, and they have the highest likelihood to recommend military service. That's why building and strengthening these community ties is so important. And when Blue Star Families focuses on providing opportunities for military families to connect, build connections with one another and with civilians. Next slide, please. So the next finding that we want to explore has been a recurring issue for military families, especially over the past few years. And you heard Michelle talk a little bit about it. I think there are definitely places where it is particularly acute, Hawaii being a good example. But let's dig into the finding. Next slide. While it remains an acute issue for many families, we actually see some positive news here. It appears that some of the policy changes to support military families' financial security might be paying off. This year, fewer military families are paying more than their anticipated cost share for housing. Last year, 81% of families who had an out-of-pocket housing cost were spending over their anticipated cost share, so that 5% of housing that military families are responsible for. That's estimated about $200 a month. So 81% of families were paying more than that. This year, it was down to 73%. So it's still a majority, but it is trending in the right direction. This is also the lowest proportion that we've seen since 2020 when we started tracking it this way. However, housing costs are still a top contributor to financial stress for families. Next slide, please. We still see it's not only a top contributor to financial stress, but it's still a top 5 concern for military families this year, as you saw on the top issues slide. We also see that it may impact families' likelihood to recommend service. As you see on this slide, as out-of-pocket costs increase, likelihood to recommend service decreases. As you're spending hundreds out of pocket on housing, your likelihood to recommend service may decline. Next slide, please. Okay. In some more positive news about relocation, it's not specifically about housing, but relocation expenses, which are very tied to housing. Many of these issues are interconnected, and so they impact one another. Housing costs impact relocation costs, and so on. So positive news about relocation expenses. We saw an extension of the temporary lodging expense benefit from 10 days to 14 days. So that means that families who are moving to a new duty station, instead of having temporary housing covered for 10 days, they have it for 14 days. So they have a few more days to locate and obtain that permanent housing at that duty station. And that benefits a majority of military families. Most families will use at least some temporary lodging before moving into their next duty station. 57% in our survey said that they would use temporary lodging. And of those who moved in the last year, 2/3 were able to move into permanent housing within that 15 days. So that's, again, positive movement. However, we still see 1/3 that are of family respondents who completed a recent PCS within the last year, indicated that they utilized temporary housing for more than 15 days. So they're still spending some money out of pocket. And of those who moved in the past year, 1/3 report that they have no unreimbursed expenses, but 1 in 10 reported spending over $2,000 in unreimbursed temporary housing costs. So we know it's improving, but it's still a pain point for many people. Next slide, please. Okay. Spouse employment and childcare. As Michelle mentioned, this is one of the key perennial issues. It's probably the epitome of what I consider perennial issues, because this has been a top issue for decades at this point. And we combine spouse employment and childcare again, because they're very interconnected. These two are almost very difficult to disentangle because they're very connected to one another. Next slide, please. As Michelle said, spouse employment remains a top issue. It is the top issue. Again, I think it might be the 7th year in a row. It's still a top issue among spouses, but it's also a top issue among service members. But there is some good news that's buried in here as well. While the unemployment rate for spouses is similar to last year, it's at 22%, and that's similar to other research that we've seen. This year, we see labor force participation climb from 58% in 2021 to 65% last year to 70% this year. So we're seeing more spouses participate in the labor force despite that unemployment rate staying the same. This means that the proportion of spouses who are employed also increased from 46% in 2021 to 48% in 2022 to 54% in 2023. I interpret this to mean that the barriers to work aren't so overwhelming that spouses are just saying, I'm not going to look for work while we're here, or I'm not going to look for work. So while that unemployment rate is static, and that is very frustrating and challenging for the people who've been working on this issue for a really long time, we're seeing more spouses employed overall. So there's some good news nuggets in here. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, childcare and employment are intertwined. Childcare remains one of the top barriers to spouse employment, as well as balancing service member job demands. Among spouses who aren't employed but need or want paid employment and need childcare in order to work, the majority say the primary reason they're not working is because childcare is too expensive. For families who have childcare needs, so limiting the sample just to those who have a need for childcare costs is right behind housing costs as the greatest financial stressor. So housing costs remains the top one for everybody, but for families with childcare needs, that's a great financial stressor too. And Michelle brought up a great point at the beginning that she was surprised to not see childcare rise up further on the top issues. And I think it's important to consider that like those top issues are top issues for everybody, regardless of whether or not they have children or have children who have have a childcare need. So I think if we restricted it to just people who have childcare needs, that placement among the top 5 might go up. One of the things that is a benefit of being a military family is there are some programs that are intended to assist military families in finding childcare. But most families are not using CDC's Child Development Centers on base or family care centers, which are regulated private child care homes on installations. Just 20% of spouses who have a need for childcare to work use CDCs, and only 5% are using family care centers, while almost 40% report hiring a babysitter occasionally, or asking friends or family members for help, or using an off-base private childcare center. Furthermore, while we have great programs like Child Care Aware and fee assistance programs, only 11% of spouses who have a need for childcare are using fee assistance programs. Now, the majority of families are living off the installation. They're living out in the community, which may mean that using childcare on post or on the installation is inconvenient. Families may also not be aware of fee assistance programs, not know how to apply for them, or have difficulty navigating the process with their chosen childcare provider. So there are some opportunities that we have to expand awareness and utilization of some of these benefit programs. Next slide, please. Okay, more positive news. Portable work may be helping spouses stay employed. 1/3 of our employed spouses said that they were able to maintain their employment through their last PCS. Those who did also reported that they had better family financial situations than those who left their job due to a relocation. We see an increase in remote work as well. So portable jobs doesn't necessarily mean remote work. A lot of it is remote work, but it might also be employers who are able to move an employee from one duty station to another. For example, if you work at Starbucks and you work here at Fort Liberty, you might be able to transfer your position to another Starbucks at a different duty station. But for many people, that means remote work. 24% of our active duty spouse respondents who relocated within the last year reported that they worked 100% remotely, compared to just 14% who relocated between 1 and 4 years ago. So if you look at that as a timestamp, you can see how there may be more spouses who are working remotely in the past year. Nearly 2/3 of spouse respondents who were employed at least part-time said that they worked some portion of their hours remotely in the past 12 months. And 2/3 who completed all their hours remotely, worked entirely remotely, were able to maintain their employment with the same organization through a relocation, compared to just 7% of those who completed all their hours in person. So we can see how remote work may be helping spouses retain their employment through a relocation. And employed spouses are more likely than their unemployed peers to recommend military service. Next slide, please. Okay. Another good news, but work remains to be done. That's sort of the theme of many of these findings, is that there's some positive movement and there's still work to do. So the job is not yet done. One of the challenges to spouse employment has been license and certification portability from state to state. It is improving. We've seen a lot of work in this in the past few years. A majority of our active duty spouses whose license or certification was honored at their new duty station after relocating said that they were able to start working as soon as they arrived. And that's the goal. That's what we want to see, is spouses able to just start in immediately. However, for those who needed a new license or certification, nearly 2/3 reported it took 2 or more months to get that new license or certification and start working. And 20% were waiting 9 or more months. So we want to address those who are waiting a really long time to get their license or certification sorted out. We also asked these spouses who were waiting for their license or certification how much income they might have lost while waiting for licensure. And the largest portion said between $5,000 and $10,000. So that's still a bit of an income loss that families are experiencing as a result of relocation. But again, we're seeing some positive movement with needs that remain. All right, next slide, please. Okay. One of the key challenges for military families with frequent relocations is maintaining or establishing social ties. This finding explores that issue in a bit more depth. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we know that strong support networks are a critical component of resilience and well-being, yet frequent challenges, frequent relocations make maintaining those strong connections challenging for military families. Most military families in our sample had moved 4 or more times, and 1/3 had moved in the past 12 months. We know families are moving relatively frequently. The survey of active duty spouses had estimated that, or noted that families move on average every 25 months. So that's a pretty frequent relocation. When we asked about how military families are finding new social connections when they get to a new duty station in an open-ended question, we heard about how they're finding friends through children's activities, through neighbors, through employment, or through their religious community. But one concerning one is that 1 in 5 report they don't or haven't yet established new relationships. So we know that those things are so important. We know we need to be able to plug into new connections pretty quickly. Next slide, please. So the majority of military families, when thinking about their closest contacts and their closest connections, are connecting with them virtually rather than in person. Now we live in a world where this is possible, which is incredible. It's a little different than it was 20-some years ago, but that virtual connection doesn't truly replicate the benefit of having in-person connections. Most often they're connecting with their closest connections virtually because of that geographic proximity, because you're moving from place to place. And while maintaining virtual connections is important and it's beneficial for families, those who were able to engage with close contacts in person, regardless of how frequently, reported higher well-being. And this is one of the reasons, again, that Blue Star Families is focusing on providing opportunities for families to connect to one another, either virtually through our neighborhood platform, but also in person through our chapter events or military families outdoors programming on national programs like that. Also, side note, if you have not checked out our neighborhood, you should. We just launched our new platform this week. By all accounts, it's beautiful. Please go check it out. Next slide, please. We see that these social networks and social ties become even more important during family separations. We know that families are often separated due to military service. The second most common concern for families this year is time away from family. We see that about 3/4 of our military families report being separated for at least a month within the past year, and the average separation from the service member is about 3 months within the past year. So this is a pretty common experience for families. And we know that these separations bring stress. When we ask in an open-ended question about what are the things that are impacted by a family separation, it's things like parenting responsibilities, childcare, household responsibilities, and challenges to both adult and child mental health. So families also report that these social networks are a critical resource in helping them manage the stressors of separation. In open-ended question about managing these family separations, families also reported relying on their social network and even relocating to be with family who can help them. They also reported paying for additional services to help pick up the slack, which may be because they don't yet have a social network to rely on. You may not be able to call your neighbor to help with a last-minute childcare, so you have to pay for a sitter, that sort of thing. All right, next slide. EFMP families. This year, we took a closer look at the experiences of EFMP, Exceptional Family Member Program, families, and their ability to access healthcare and educational supports. Next slide, please. This is another little bit of positive news. We do see that EFMP enrolled families have slightly higher rates of maintaining educational accommodations and services after a relocation when compared to their non-enrolled peers. So we know that about 1/4 of active duty family respondents are enrolled in EFMP. Most are enrolled for their children. Here we see that families who are enrolled and have a kid who has a special education need, whether that's a 504 plan or an IEP plan, when they relocate, it can be challenging for them to receive the same accommodations and services at that new duty station in the new school district. But we see that if you're enrolled in EFMP, you have slightly higher rates of being able to maintain that same accommodation and services. Families also reported using the EFMP office to help advocate for their child when their special education plan was changed. So we see some benefits here. Next slide. We also see that many families are enrolled in EFMP for a child who has a mental health diagnosis, but they often experience difficulty gaining timely access to mental health care for their kids. When we looked at healthcare access for these families who are active duty family respondents whose oldest child receives mental health care and is enrolled in EFMP compared to those who weren't enrolled, it's important we see that those EFMP enrolled families report longer wait times than their counterparts who are not enrolled in EFMP. Now, this might be due to the fact that EFMP enrolled families may have more intense needs for niche specialty care than their peers who are not enrolled, or because pediatric mental health care is really exceptionally short of providers at the moment in comparison to other specialty care. Regardless of EFMP enrollment, many respondents are waiting 2 or more months for care, which we'll discuss a little bit more in the next finding. While healthcare is a critical benefit, especially for these families, it keeps these families in military service often. Their likelihood of recommending military service to others decreases as wait times for specialty care increase. So the longer they're waiting, the less likely they are to recommend military service. Next slide, please. If you have a question, please type it in the chat. We're monitoring those things, and we're able to respond somewhat, and we may be able to address the questions at the end. So I'm going to get through the rest of the slide, and then we'll go to the questions. Okay. Despite the fact that EFMP enrollment, there's evidence that says that EFMP enrollment doesn't limit career options for service members, many military families still perceive enrollment in EFMP as a potential limitation for future opportunities for the family, including career opportunities for the service member and opportunities for the family to live overseas. So many families choose not to enroll in EFMP, even if they have a child or a family member who is eligible. We saw about half of our active duty family respondents who have a child with a diagnosed condition report their child was enrolled in the program. So we don't see that everybody who is potentially eligible for it may be enrolling. Now, not every diagnosis requires enrollment, but we do see that there may be fewer families enrolling in the program than are eligible for it. We also see, we asked this year of families who are enrolled whether they would disenroll if they were given the option. And 4 in 10 active duty families respondents said that they would. So it becomes important to clearly articulate the benefits to families of enrollment and explore their reasons for wanting to disenroll, and addressing the narratives that are circulating about impacts to service members' career and impacts to families' opportunities to live together, particularly overseas. Those are opportunities to continue to enhance this program. Next slide, please. Okay, healthcare access. So I just talked about healthcare access for families who are with a child who's receiving mental health care in particular, EFMP families in particular. Now I want to talk a little bit more generally about healthcare access, particularly access to specialty care for all military families. Next slide. So just like families who are seeking mental health care for a child, access to timely specialty health care can be a challenge for other families as well. And many military families see these long wait times as unreasonable. So that can deteriorate the valued benefit of healthcare. We know that healthcare is a valued benefit. It's one of the reasons that military families recommend military service when they do, but that value can be deteriorated as they are waiting longer for specialty care appointments. So about 40% of our active duty family respondents said it took more than 2 months to see a specialist, while the average specialist wait time in the US in general is less than a month. I think it's around 26 days. Next slide. I do want to touch back on children's mental health care because I know this is a critical issue for many military families. There is a dire shortage of mental health care providers across the country, in particular for pediatric mental health care. In fact, the country needs over 6,000 mental health care practitioners to eliminate the national shortage. But this problem can disproportionately impact military families, not only because of the unique stressors of military life, like family separations, like relocation, but relocation also can make it difficult to maintain continuity of care. More than half of active duty family respondents with a child who's 20 years of age or 20 years or younger is currently receiving mental health care, reported that it took more than 2 months from seeking care to begin receiving that mental health care treatment. And when families are moving on average every 25 months, If you have to wait more than 2 months every time you relocate, those are frequent disruptions in continuity of care. One additional barrier to mental health care that's unique to military families is the concern that accessing care will limit either the service member's career or the child's future potential military career, which is a continued concern. Next slide, please. All right, the final finding that I'll present is what we found on food insecurity, and then I'll turn it over to my peers at the Daniello Institute. Next slide. So we continue to see that about 1 in 6 active duty families report food insecurity. When we're looking at enlisted families only, this number increases to 1 in 4 enlisted active duty families who report food insecurity. One important piece that I think it's critical to highlight is that helps highlight the interconnected nature of many of these quality of life issues is the impact of spouse employment on food insecurity. When we look at just unemployed spouses, 37% of unemployed spouses are reporting food insecurity in comparison to just 11% of spouses who are employed at least part-time. So we really see that there are contributing factors around spouse employment to food insecurity in military families. Next slide. We asked families in an open-ended question about their experiences with food insecurity, and it was eye-opening. We have hundreds of stories and quotes from families who are what they experienced, how their family addressed it. And in these stories, families reported they decreased their food quality, they went into debt, they reduced their savings, they applied for benefit programs like SNAP and WIC to afford food. And food banks and charities were also a resource for families. Among just the food insecure families, 14% reported that food banks or charities were a major source of food for their families. And you can see one of the stories on the screen now. I won't read it to you, but it was one of the pretty powerful quotes that we saw. Next slide, please. All right, basic needs allowance. So the basic needs allowance was established in the 2023 NDAA and was established in the NDAA, was implemented in 2023 to provide a monthly income supplement for service members whose household income fell below 150% of the national poverty level. So it was really aimed at service members who have young junior service members with lower income and bigger families. And it's important to note that this basic needs allowance was not intended to be the sole solution for food insecurity. Like the other challenges that I've talked about, this is a complex issue. It requires a number of solutions at a number of different levels to solve. One of the challenges is that military family food insecurity doesn't always neatly correspond to rank and income, but often occurs in the context of certain specific stressors. Spouse employment might be one of them. Relocation, unexpected expenses. Those are all specific stressors that may push a family into food insecurity. So it's important to note that the Basic Needs Allowance program started in January of 2023, and the survey fielded in May to July of 2023. So we're only looking roughly at the first 5 to 7 months of the program. So what we learned in this limited but novel data is that awareness and applications for the program may be limited. About over half of our active duty family respondents didn't know what the basic needs allowance was, and among these, 1 in 5 were food insecure. Only about 3% reported applying for the benefit, and another 3% did not apply because they did not want to involve their chain of command. 40% of those who didn't apply because they didn't want to involve their chain of command were food insecure. So of those who did apply for the basic needs allowance, 2/3 of them were approved. Among the approved, 43% were still experiencing food insecurity. So this is not the total solution to food insecurity. It may address some of it, and it may be moving us in the right direction, but there's still some barriers in place. Okay, next slide. And with that, I would love to turn it over to my wonderful colleague at the Daniello Institute for Veterans and Military Families, Dr. Jeanette Yee Harvey, one of our fantastic partners. Jeanette, I'm so glad you're with us today. I will let you take it away and talk more about our veteran transition.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Strong, for the introduction and the finding thus far on several aspects of military family life in the 2023 MFLS. So as we know, while service members and their families face unique challenges while in service, the military to civilian transition is also a time of substantial change. So in the last 10 years of our collaboration with Blue Star Families, we at the Dinello Institute for Veterans and Military Families always try to use the MFLS as an opportunity to learn more about the processes, needs, and the challenges of transition and post-service life for veterans and their families. While we have previously considered a variety of conditions that can be considered as risk and protective factors of transition, this year we explored how retirement status can impact the military to civilian transition. Next slide, please. So specifically this year, we saw that retired veteran respondents generally felt that they were prepared to successfully navigate the transition process compared to non-retired veteran respondents. There are many factors that can be linked to a sense of preparedness, and having the time to prepare is an aspect of this. Using the data, we found that time to prepare for separation from service can be varied based on retirement statuses. Also, more retired veteran respondents were able to prepare for these changes 1 to 2 years prior to separating. Moreover, veteran respondents who are not retired said that they did not or were not able to prepare for the transition. This is important because the MFLS data also show that more veteran respondents who are prepared also characterize their transition process as smooth. So why does it all matter? Unsurprisingly, veteran respondents who said that they had a smooth transition were more likely to recommend military service to a young family member, and this relationship persisted regardless of retirement status. It was more about their perception of how their transition was associated with their likelihood to recommend. So overall, results from this year's report support recommendations that preparations, including having the time to prepare, is an important aspect of the process that can help secure a smooth transition for our veterans. And I have finished mine, and I will turn it back to Dr. Strong for the next portion of this deep dive.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. All right, so we went, I'll be honest, I went a little over time, so we have a limited amount of time for discussion, but I want to dig into the questions. First, I'd like to invite some friends and colleagues to join me. Carly Howell is our Associate Director of Research. She worked very in depth with this data and all of these findings, and I invite her to come and help me answer some of these questions. Dr. Jeanette E. Harvey will come back and answer questions that are related to veteran transition. Sally Velez is our Booz Allen Deploy Family Retention Fellow, who's working with our research team for her Deploy Fellowship focused on family retention. And Ryan Brennan is our USAA Deploy Food Insecurity Fellow, working on our government affairs team for her Deploy Fellowship, focusing on food insecurity. I also want to take this moment to shout out Kit Higgison, who is our research manager, who not only worked very in depth on this research and with the data, but is also working behind the scenes today to help us field questions. So thank you all for joining me today. Let's dig into the questions.
All right, the first question is for Jessica. Erica asked, how will this information be used to make the system better?
Wonderful. I love that question because that's why we're here. Our task with this research is to inform decision makers at all levels and inspire continued research, continued conversation and discussions about solutions to these problems. So this data is shared with government leaders. For example, last week at our in-person event, Representatives Houlihan and Bacon, who co-hosted our release event, on the Hill. They are the co-chairs of the House Armed Services Quality of Life Panel, which will release a report in the next couple of months with recommendations on how to improve military family quality of life. And this data helped inform that report. So this has been their focus for the last year, and your survey responses have informed their recommendations. We are sharing it with senior military leaders. For example, the Secretary of the Air Force, I will not read it, but had a lovely quote about the importance of the military family lifestyle survey in the work that they are doing, and shows us where we're making progress and where we have work to do. So we know that our senior military leaders are looking at these findings and data and using them to inform their decisions. We share it with industry leaders and employers. Remember, employers are the other half of the equation for solving spouse employment. So we share our findings with them and encourage them to do their part to hire and retain military spouses with joint efforts like our 4+1 program with Hiring Our Heroes that encourages employers to hire and retain military spouse employees. We share it with philanthropic investors who provide support for programs and efforts that help address these issues. We share it with other military and veteran serving organizations. Give a shout out in the chat if you are here from an MSO and VSO. I've seen a few of you. We share these with other MSOs and VSOs who can help advocate and support. And it's used internally at BSF to create enhanced programming that helps support military families. For example, we know from this report and from other work that we've done how important belonging is. So we built chapters to help families plug into social networks that help them belong. We launched Blue Star Welcome Week in September to help communities welcome military families to develop that sense of belonging. I could go on for a long time, but I will pass it back. So pass it back to Sally and Ryan for the next question, but it's used at all levels.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This next question is a two-parter for Carly, and the questions are asked by Kayla and Maria. The first part, the phrasing of these surveys sometimes make it difficult to get to the root cause of the issues. Childcare is listed as not making the top 5 concerns, while later in the paper, it is cited that the primary issue with military spouse employment is childcare. Can you talk on the reasoning behind this phrasing, but also pair it with the data shows that the ability to find and pay for childcare continues to be a top barrier to employment for spouses. However, childcare ranks 7th on the list for concerns for active duty spouses. Are there ways to look at the data and pair spouse employment and childcare to give a clearer picture of how childcare enables spouse employment? With childcare ranking at 7th as an independent challenge, it may not receive the attention and funding required to make the positive changes for families going forward.
Thank you, Sally. These are both really great questions. And as Dr. Strong has said, and Mrs. Brito has said, and I think any of us who are have either been a military spouse or are a military spouse, we know that, childcare and spouse employment absolutely go hand in hand. So to address the first part of this question, the question on top issues is really just meant to be a broad look at the aspects of military life that are the most concerning. It is not really meant to do a deep dive into anything. And then when we look at employment, specifically why somebody is not employed, that is where we are trying to add a little bit of context to that individual situation. Understanding that for somebody taking this survey, those two things, why you are not employed and the top issues of concern, could be exactly the same thing. So that's just not typically how we would report them. As we did report, and as Sally mentioned, childcare comes in at number 7 for active duty spouses when we just look at the entire active duty spouse respondent population. But I took a look. I love the ability that I love when people pre-submitted some questions with your registration. So I was able to take a look. It's not something that we have reported, but when I looked just at active duty spouses who are unemployed, childcare challenges rises to the 4th top issue for them. It goes up to 36%. And when I looked a different way and said, well, let's look at all active duty spouses, regardless of their employment status, but who said that they need childcare in order to work, then childcare jumps all the way to the 2nd top issue. It becomes 53% of active duty spouses said that's the top issue, second only to spouse employment. So obviously the sample sizes get much smaller as we are making those cuts, but definitely hear you on, we have access and ways to report out this data that might not be the most beneficial for some of you as you're working for the same issue we're working towards, but hear you on distinguishing those different levels and maybe trying to do that a little more in depth in the future. And so we will certainly take that into account as we get our data back here in a few months from 2024.
Thank you, Carly. The next question comes from Rebecca, and Dr. Strong or Carly, you can answer. How are you analyzing the data? Have you done a qualitative side to better understand the culture of the Army and what the actual issues are? It is hard to learn all you need about the challenges of military families from a survey if you are not living within a military community. You have to understand why they answer the survey in the way that they do. How will the answers in this survey help further support for military families? Will it change anything? We fill out multiple housing surveys and things stay the same. How will this be different?
Yeah, let me jump in there. Thank you, Ryan. So first, I think it's really important to note that our team are military families or former military families. I'm an active duty Army spouse. I'm stationed at Fort Liberty for the third time. And I've relocated during this survey fielding. So we're all very familiar with relocation and the culture and finding childcare. Our team members are Army spouses, Space Force spouses, former Navy spouses who are former veteran spouses. I didn't say that very well, but a veteran spouse of a Navy service member. There we go. So we're very familiar with this, and I deeply understand. I think that's a great advantage to be able to understand from a personal perspective, as well as a professional and research perspective, what we're looking at. To talk about the methodology and how we are analyzing the data. We do both qualitative and quantitative analysis for the data. Every open-ended response you guys type in, a member of our team reads all of them. So we can also, one of the benefits of an annual survey is we can iterate on the research pretty quickly. As you've heard us talking about, you have questions about some of the findings that we have this year. We're already looking at next year and how are we going to plug that in and ask those questions in a new way. So we see that this year only 11% of spouses are using fee assistance programs. We're going to ask more about that next year. To the point about filling out multiple surveys and things staying the same, I hear that. We've been doing the military family lifestyle survey for several years, and we still see that military spouse employment is a top concern. What's important to remember is that these issues are complex and there isn't a single solution for them. So the availability of childcare is not a simple fix. It's a national issue. The BAH rates aren't a simple fix. Spouse employment is not a simple fix, or it would have been done by now because there's a lot of people working on this, a lot of effort behind it. So these findings and other research and the efforts of advocates at all levels, like government, at military, in the industry, in military and veteran support organizations, all of them together collectively drive change. So there's no one piece that's going to be the magic bullet that's going to solve the problems. So we have to continue to advocate. This data and the stories helped arm advocates to push for change. So that's what's going to make the difference in seeing the progress that we've seen so far and continuing to push that forward. Anything else to add from our team? Okay, back to you, Sally and Ryan.
Thank you. Carly, this question is for you. Megan asked, how is food insecurity represented in the data? After moving to DC to Joint Base Anacostia Bowling, I have seen many of my neighbors and families in our SFRG struggling to make ends meet. However, many are struggling to find solutions due to transportation or schedule conflicts. Although there seems to be a need, the military seems to be turning a blind eye to this issue specifically.
All right, thank you. Dr. Strong addressed when she was, going over her presentation of all of our data, that food insecurity is certainly an issue that we have found in our surveys, both this year and in previous surveys. And active duty family respondents continue to report higher levels of food insecurity than civilian counterparts. We use the USDA scale so that we have that comparable data. This year, 1 in 6 of our active duty family respondents reported experiencing food insecurity. And as she just said as well, that these problems are multidimensional, and food insecurity is certainly one of those problems. It's not as simple as saying, if we just pay E1 through E4s more, food insecurity is going to go away. It's not as simple as saying if everybody was employed, food insecurity would go away. So I'm gonna push back just a tiny bit on understanding it can feel, certainly if you are experiencing it, it certainly must feel like the military is turning a blind eye. I would say that the military actually is listening and they are making strides towards addressing food insecurity. However, they're slow. As we know, we would like things to be done and fixed. And when we have perhaps an identifiable solution, we'd like it to be done immediately. And that, unfortunately, is just not the way that our government or our Department of Defense works. So we will continue to make the recommendations to change programs that there currently are or to implement new programs. And as we saw with the basic needs allowance, that is something that we have advocated for, but Mazzone and many other MSOs and BSOs in this space have pushed for years. So it is because of that work and because the DoD and Congress did finally say, this is an issue, we need to take some sort of step, that we got the BNA, the basic needs allowance, in the first place. So now we have some new data that says, you know what, maybe not a lot of people know about it yet. And maybe we need to expand it so some other people would be eligible for it. So definitely we are aware of and are keeping tabs on food insecurity, and would say that everyone in the space is certainly not turning a blind eye. Things just aren't happening as fast as we all would like them to happen. I also want to note that the basic needs allowance is just one tool in the toolbox to food insecurity, because it is so multi-dimensional. It was never designed to be like a cure-all. It is that first step. So we definitely want to see progress with it, but understand that even if we greatly expanded the eligibility, there would unfortunately probably be some other situations we needed to figure out solutions for as well.
Thank you, Carly. Looks like we have time for one question, and this question is for Dr. Yee. We're curious if there are any data on military transitions. Do service members, now veterans, think they are successful in transition? And are they successful?
Yes, we actually have a lot of data in transition. Besides a lot of the data from us that we collect at the IVMF, every year in the MFLS, we have several questions collecting information on various aspects of transition, such as the sense of preparedness, attendance of transition assistance program, items related to employment and financial transitions, wellness, and others. So there's a lot of that. However, we purposefully do not define what is transition, because we're interested in those subjects and how our respondents perceive those questions. So we ask veteran respondents to think back on their transition process. We allow them to consider it in different timeframes. So some might think of it as of the year they were separating from the military. Others may consider it even in a longer time frame. So generally, those veteran respondents who perceive their transitions to be difficult, they are also more likely to report other negative outcomes, both during and after transition. So the question of whether they're successful or not is actually really subjective, right? So if your goal after transitioning is to find another job, to be able to provide for your family, and if you're able to hit those goals, then maybe you are considered successful. So it's based on your personal experience. So I think there is an element of empowering veterans to achieve what they want to achieve in their post-service life. That's very important thread throughout our work. And so I hope this answers some of the questions that was posed to us.
I'm trying to unmute. Okay. I want to thank you all. Sadly, we went a little bit over time and there's more questions that we don't have a chance to answer, but I want to turn it back to Dr. Knight to close us out for the day.
Thank you, Jess. And also thank you everyone who played a part in this research. It is truly groundbreaking and makes all of the difference for systemic and policy-based solutions on all of these topics. So just everyone who had a hand in that, thank you, thank you, thank you. Also, we are over time, but my goodness, the hour obviously flew by, and there was so much data to dig through, and also so much more data to dig through. So I welcome everyone who joined this call. Really reach out to all of the teams who are represented here. They're data nerds, and I say that in the best and most complimentary fashion. They would love to chat about this more. So just open invitation to everyone here. We appreciate all of you who came out to review the findings and ask your questions. Don't forget that fielding for the 2024 survey starts next Wednesday. Wednesday. You also heard Dr. Strong talk at the top of this call. There are some demographics and populations that we really would like to have greater representation in, particularly for junior enlisted. So if you know folks or organizations or groups that have access to those networks, we all know how word of mouth works. Please, please, please share that with them. We want that feedback within our survey results. We hope you will also all fill it out personally and share with your community and continue this conversation and collectively work to build solutions. So have a great rest of your week, and thank you from all of the Blue Star families and IVMF staff. Yeah, have a great Thursday all.